The sound of heavy breathing and flesh-striking leather filled the high-ceilinged room of the Sterling Elite Martial Arts Academy. It was nearly 9 at night, a time when most honest people were at home resting, but inside the academy, the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and testosterone. In the corner, almost invisible against the gray walls, Ma'am Clara moved with a slow, rhythmic persistence. She was a woman of 60, her hair tucked neatly under a faded blue headwrap, her body hidden beneath a shapeless gray custodian uniform that smelled of lemon bleach and peppermint oil. To the 20 students sweating on the mats, she was not a person. She was merely a fixture of the building, as unnoticed as the water fountain or the fire extinguisher. She dipped her mop into the wheeled yellow bucket, the water swirling dark and gray, and wrung it out with hands that were calloused and thick, hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime scrubbing away other people's messes. She hummed a low, soulful gospel tune, a vibration that lived deep in her chest, trying to create a small bubble of peace in this temple of violence. But peace was not welcome here tonight. Jax Sterling, the head instructor and self-proclaimed Prince of the City, was in a foul mood. He was 28 years old, sculpted like a Greek statue, and possessed a vanity that filled the room more than his students did. He had been watching the old woman from the corner of his eye for the last 10 minutes, his irritation growing with every squeak of her mop against the polished floor. Jax signaled for the class to stop, his hand slicing through the air with sharp authority. The room went silent instantly, save for the rhythmic swish of Clara's mop. He walked toward her, his bare feet slapping against the mats, a predator stalking prey that didn't even know it was being hunted. He stopped right at the edge of the mat, just inches from where Clara was working on a stubborn scuff mark. He stood there, hands on his hips, waiting for her to acknowledge him, but Clara kept her eyes on the floor, her humming unbroken. It was this quiet dignity, this refusal to shrink, that ignited a spark of rage in his chest. "Hey," Jax barked, his voice echoing off the mirrors. "Auntie, I'm talking to you." Clara paused. She slowly straightened her back, hearing the vertebrae pop one by one, and turned to face him. Her eyes were deep and brown, filled with a tired patience that only black women of a certain age seem to possess, the look of someone who has seen boys like him come and go 1,000 times. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jax," she said, her voice smooth and deep like molasses. "I'm just trying to get the sweat off the floor before it stains. You know how the owner gets." Jax laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that invited his students to join in. A few of them chuckled nervously, shifting their weight, while others looked down at their feet. "The owner pays you to clean, not to distract my elite fighters with that noise you call singing," Jax sneered, stepping onto the floor she had just cleaned, deliberately leaving a sweaty footprint on the wet tile. This moment right here, the arrogance of youth clashing with the silent strength of experience, is a story as old as time, but the ending of this night would be unlike anything these students had ever witnessed. If you love stories where justice is served cold and the underestimated rise up to silence the arrogant, make sure you press that subscribe button right now, because Ma'am Clara is about to teach a lesson that isn't written in any manual. Jax watched the water soak into the hem of his expensive pants and frowned. "Look at this," he complained, gesturing to his own mess. "You're incompetent, you're slow, you're loud, and honestly, you're an eyesore. I bet you've never worked hard a day in your life, have you? Just pushing dirt from one side to the other." Clara looked at the footprint, then up at Jax. She didn't look angry, she looked disappointed. "Work is work, son," she said softly, "and respect is something you give to get." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The students gasped. No one spoke to Jax Sterling like that. His face flushed a dark red. He stepped fully off the mat, invading her personal space, towering over her small frame. "Respect," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. You want respect. In this house, respect is earned with blood and sweat, not with a mop. I bet you don't even know what discipline is." He grabbed the handle of her mop, stopping her from moving it. "I challenge you." The words hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. A black belt in his prime challenging a 60-year-old grandmother. "Excuse me," Clara asked, her grip tightening ever so slightly on the wood. "You heard me," Jax announced, turning to his class to ensure he had an audience for his cruelty. "Since you think you know so much about respect, step onto the mat, just for 2 minutes. If you can stay standing, I'll apologize if you can't." "Well, then you pack up your bucket and get out of my gym forever." He leaned in close, his breath hot against her face. "Unless you're scared that your old bones will turn to dust." Clara looked at the young man, really looked at him, and for a split second, the tiredness vanished from her eyes, replaced by a flash of steel that was cold, sharp, and dangerous. It was a look that belonged to a woman named the Iron Rose, a woman buried 30 years in the past. She sighed, a long, heavy exhalation that sounded like a final warning. "Mr. Jax," she said, letting go of the mop handle so it clattered against the bucket. "I promised the Lord I wouldn't do this no more. But if you insist on learning the hard way, I suppose I can clock out for a few minutes." Jax's laughter was the first thing to break the heavy silence, a sharp and grating sound that bounced off the mirrors and seemed to mock the very air in the room. He clapped his hands together slowly, shaking his head as if he had just heard the world's most ridiculous joke. He looked at his students, his eyes bright with malicious amusement, silently inviting them to share in the spectacle. To him, this was nothing more than entertainment, a way to break the monotony of a Thursday night training session by humiliating someone he viewed as beneath him. He fully expected Clara to back down, to mutter an apology and retreat to the safety of her mop bucket, but she did not move. She stood there, her posture surprisingly upright, her hands resting loosely at her sides, watching him with an expression that was unsettlingly calm. It wasn't the look of a frightened employee worrying about her paycheck. It was the look of a parent watching a child throw a tantrum, patiently waiting for the screaming to stop so the lesson could begin. The students shifted uncomfortably, glancing between their instructor and the cleaning lady. They sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle thickening of the tension that made the hair on their arms stand up, though they couldn't quite explain why. Ma'am Clara turned away from Jax, ignoring his laughter as if it were nothing more than static on a radio. She walked over to the wooden bench near the lockers, her heavy work shoes squeaking softly against the floor. Every movement she made was deliberate and slow, stripping away the urgency of the situation. She sat down and began to untie her laces. Her fingers, usually so busy scrubbing and wringing, moved with a strange, methodical grace. She removed her left shoe, then her right, placing them neatly side by side beneath the bench. Then she stood up and reached for the top button of her gray custodian smock. The sound of the plastic button popping open seemed incredibly loud in the quiet gym. One by one, she undid them, revealing a faded black t-shirt underneath. As she shrugged the heavy gray uniform off her shoulders and folded it carefully onto the bench, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The woman who stood before them was not the frail, shapeless figure they had ignored for months. Without the bulky uniform, Clara's arms were visible, and they were a roadmap of her history. Her skin was dark and smooth, but the muscles underneath were roped and defined, corded with the kind of strength that doesn't come from lifting weights in an air-conditioned gym, but from decades of hard labor and perhaps something else. Running down the length of her right forearm was a long, jagged scar, old and silver against her skin, a souvenir from a life she had buried long ago. Maya, the young girl who had been watching from the back, felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She had seen scars like that before. In the old grainy documentaries her father used to watch about the underground fighting circuits of the 90s. She squinted, trying to reconcile the image of the sweet old lady who gave her peppermint candies with the imposing figure now standing by the bench. There was a solidity to Clara now, a grounding that made her seem heavier, as if she were rooted to the earth itself. Jax's laughter died in his throat. He blinked, momentarily thrown off by the transformation. He had expected to see a frail old body, weak and trembling. Instead, he was looking at someone who stood with the relaxed confidence of a veteran. But his ego, bruised by her earlier comments and fueled by the presence of his audience, quickly pushed aside any warning bells ringing in his head. He smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Well, look at that," he jeered, trying to regain control of the room. "The janitor has muscles. What did you do, Auntie? Carry a lot of heavy trash bags in your day, or did you get that scar falling off a ladder?" He stepped onto the center of the mat, spreading his arms wide. "Come on then, don't keep us waiting. The clock is ticking and I have a real class to teach." Clara didn't answer him. She walked toward the mat, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. As she stepped onto the blue rubber surface, she closed her eyes for a brief second. The sensation of the mat under her soles was a time machine, instantly transporting her back 30 years. She could smell the ozone and blood of the underground pits in Chicago. She could hear the roar of the crowd chanting the name Iron Rose. She had promised herself she would never step back into this world. She had promised the Lord, on the day they lowered her brother into the ground, that her hands would only be used for healing and cleaning, never for hurting. But as she opened her eyes and looked at Jax, this boy who thought strength was about humiliation, who thought power was about noise, she knew that sometimes the only way to heal a rot is to cut it out. This wasn't a fight for glory. This was a lesson. She exhaled slowly, a long breath that emptied her lungs of frustration and filled them with focus. She stopped 5 feet away from Jax. She didn't raise her fists. She didn't bounce on her toes or shift her weight aggressively like the fighters in the movies. She simply stood there. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, her knees slightly bent, her hands open and relaxed at her waist. It was a stance that looked deceptively simple, but to a trained eye it was perfect. It was the mountain stance, an ancient posture designed to root the fighter to the ground, making them immovable. Maya, watching from the edge of the circle, felt a shiver run down her spine. She realized with a jolt of terror that the cleaning lady wasn't just standing there, she was waiting. "Okay, Grandma," Jax said, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet, his hands coming up in a loose, arrogant guard. "Here are the rules: no biting, no scratching, and try not to break a hip. If you can touch me just once, I'll count it as a win for you. Ready?" He didn't wait for an answer. He threw a quick, snapping jab toward her face. It was a controlled strike, meant to startle her, to make her flinch and cover her eyes so everyone could laugh at her fear. But Clara didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She merely tilted her head to the left, a movement so subtle and minimal that the glove passed within a millimeter of her ear, disturbing the air but touching nothing. Jax frowned, pulling his hand back. He had expected her to cower. "Lucky guess," he muttered. He stepped in closer, throwing a 1-2 combination, a left jab followed by a right cross. These were faster now, thrown with a bit more heat. The students watched in stunned silence as Clara flowed around the punches like water moving around a stone. She didn't block them, she didn't bat them away. She simply wasn't where the punches landed. She pivoted on her back foot, her body turning just enough to let the violent sail harmlessly past her. It was mesmerizing, a dance of efficiency that made Jax's aggressive movements look clumsy and wasteful. "Stand still," Jax snapped, his face flushing red with embarrassment. He realized the class was quiet, too quiet. They weren't laughing anymore. He needed to end this, and he needed to end it now. He decided to stop playing. He planted his foot and unleashed a roundhouse kick, aiming for her ribs. It was a powerful blow, one that could crack bone, thrown with the full intention of hurting her. The air whistled as his shin sliced through the space where her torso had been a split second before. But Clara had stepped in, moving into the danger rather than away from it. This was the mistake amateurs made. They retreated. Veterans knew that safety was often found in the eye of the storm. As Jax's leg swung past her, missing its target, he found himself off balance, standing on one leg with his back exposed. In that moment, Clara could have struck him. She could have driven a knee into his spine or chopped the back of his neck. The Iron Rose of 30 years ago would have ended his career right there. But Clara Washington, the janitor, had a different objective. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder, a touch as light as a feather, and gave a tiny, precise push. It wasn't a shove, it was a redirection of his own momentum. Jax, already spinning and off balance, felt the world tilt. His feet tangled, and he went crashing down onto the mat face first, landing with a heavy, undignified slap that echoed through the entire gym. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. The image was impossible to process. The young, athletic black belt sprawled on the floor, and the 60-year-old cleaning lady standing over him, barely winded, her hands still relaxed at her sides. Jax scrambled to his feet, his face burning with a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated rage. His vanity had just been shattered in front of the people he was supposed to lead. "You tripped me," he yelled, his voice cracking. You got lucky. That was a cheap shot." Clara looked at him calmly. "Gravity isn't cheap, son," she said, her voice steady. "It's just the law, and right now you are fighting against laws you don't understand." Jax growled, a low, animalistic sound. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his eyes narrowing into slits. The playful bully was gone now. He was a humiliated man looking for blood. "All right," he hissed, pacing in a circle around her. "No more games. You want to see the real thing? Fine, I'm going to hurt you." He dropped into a lower stance, his muscles tensing, his breathing shifting into a sharp, rhythmic pattern. The students backed away, sensing that the safety rails had just come off. Maya took a step forward, her hand raising instinctively. "Sensei, stop," she cried out. "She's an old lady." "Silence," Jax roared, not taking his eyes off Clara. "She entered my ring. She plays by my rules." He launched himself forward, not with a single strike, but with a flurry of aggression, knees, elbows, and fists flying in a chaotic storm of violence. He was trying to overwhelm her, to drown her in speed and strength. Clara was forced to move faster now. Her feet slid across the mat in complex geometric patterns, sliding, pivoting, retreating, and advancing in a blur of gray and black. She parried a strike to her face with the palm of her hand, guiding it away. She ducked under a spinning back fist. She checked a low kick with her shin, a bone-on-bone impact that made a dull, sickening thud. Jax grimaced in pain, but adrenaline kept him going. He was landing glancing blows now, a fist grazing her shoulder, a kick thumping against her thigh, but nothing was connecting cleanly. It was like fighting a ghost. Every time he thought he had her cornered, she simply vanished to his blind side. His breathing was becoming ragged, his chest heaving. Clara, in contrast, was breathing through her nose, deep and controlled. She was watching his eyes, not his hands. She could see the fatigue setting in, the frustration clouding his judgment. She knew he was about to make a mistake. And then he did. Frustrated by her evasiveness, Jax committed too fully to a straight right cross. He put all his weight behind it, extending his arm to its limit, leaving his ribs wide open and his center of gravity too far forward. It was the opening Clara had been waiting for. She didn't dodge this time. She stepped inside his guard, her body pressing almost against his. She trapped his extended arm with her left hand, wrapping around it like a python, and with her right hand she didn't punch him. Instead, she placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. "Be still," she whispered. It wasn't a strike. It was a disruption. She used a technique known in the old circles as the stopping heart, a short, concussive burst of energy that disrupted the diaphragm. At the same time, she swept his lead leg. Jax didn't just fall this time, he collapsed. The air left his lungs in a violent whoosh, and he hit the mat flat on his back, gasping, his eyes bulging as he struggled to draw breath. He lay there, flopping like a fish out of water, panic seizing him as his body refused to obey his command to breathe. The students screamed, some rushing forward but stopping short of the mat, terrified of the woman standing in the center. Clara stood over him, looking down with a mixture of pity and sternness. She wasn't winded. She wasn't gloating. She looked sad. "You have strength, Mr. Jax," she said to the gasping man at her feet. "But you have no root. You are like a tree with no heavy branches. The first strong wind that comes along will knock you over." She knelt down beside him, ignoring the terrified looks of the students. She placed a hand on his solar plexus and pressed down firmly, then released. Jax sucked in a massive, ragged breath, coughing violently as oxygen rushed back into his starving lungs. He curled into a fetal position, clutching his chest, tears of humiliation and physical shock stinging his eyes. The room was deadly silent. The only sound was Jax's wheezing and the distant hum of the vending machine in the hallway. Clara stood up slowly, brushing a speck of dust from her black t-shirt. She looked around the circle of stunned faces until her eyes landed on Maya. The young girl was staring at her with her mouth open, her phone in her hand. Maya had been recording. Clara gave her a small, tired smile. "Baby girl," she said softly, "do me a favor. Go get my bucket. I missed a spot." The silence that followed Ma'am Clara's victory was heavier than any weight in the gym. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the usual sounds of the academy, the grunts of effort, the squeak of shoes, the thud of heavy bags, leaving only the harsh, ragged sound of Jax Sterling trying to remember how to breathe. He lay curled on the blue mat, his expensive gi twisted and disheveled, a stark contrast to the pristine image of perfection he had projected just 10 minutes earlier. The students, who usually looked at him with a mixture of fear and adoration, now looked down with something far worse, pity. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, unsure of the protocol for when their invincible leader is dismantled by the woman who cleans the toilets. Clara did not bask in the moment. She did not raise her arms in victory or offer a speech about humility. Instead, she simply bent down, picked up her yellow bucket by the handle, and walked toward the utility closet. Her gait had returned to the slow, measured limp of the elderly janitor, the warrior spirit of the Iron Rose, tucked back beneath the layers of age and invisibility. As the door to the closet clicked shut behind her, the spell in the room broke, and the whispers began, low and frantic like the buzzing of disturbed wasps. Inside the small, chemical-smelling utility room, Clara leaned her back against the cool metal door and let out a shuddering breath. Her hands, which had been as steady as stone during the confrontation, now trembled violently. She looked down at them, hands that had scrubbed floors for 20 years to wash away the sins of a previous life, and clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the dull, familiar ache in her joints. At 60, the body remembers every hit it has ever taken, and tonight, the ghosts of old injuries were waking up to haunt her. She reached for her bag, her fingers brushing against a worn leather Bible she kept in the front pocket. She closed her eyes, and the smell of lemon bleach faded, replaced instantly by the metallic tang of blood and the roar of a crowd in a dimly lit basement in Chicago, 1994. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't standing in a closet anymore. She was back in the pit, the underground arena where she had earned her name. She saw the bright, hot lights swinging overhead. She saw the face of Marcus, the Hammer, Williams, a young, arrogant fighter much like Jax. In the flashback, Marcus was taunting her, pushing her, threatening her family. Clara remembered the red haze of rage that had overtaken her that night. She remembered slipping his punch, trapping his arm, and delivering the strike, a strike she had promised never to use outside of life or death situations. She heard the sickening sound of his neck snapping back, the silence of the crowd, and the way Marcus had fallen, not to get up, but to convulse in the dirt. He hadn't died, but he never walked again. That was the night Clara Washington died and the invisible janitor was born. She had walked away from the money, the fame, and the violence, terrified of the monster living inside her own skin. She had spent decades hiding, praying that the beast was gone. But tonight, for just a few minutes, the beast had come out to play, and it terrified her more than Jax ever could. "Ma'am Clara," a soft voice from the other side of the door pulled her back to the present. Clara opened her eyes, wiping a bead of sweat from her temple. She cracked the door open to see Maya standing there, her face illuminated by the glow of her smartphone. The girl looked terrified but determined. I just wanted to say thank you," Maya whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Jax wasn't listening. "He's been bullying us for months, especially me. Nobody ever stood up to him before." Clara sighed, her expression softening into the grandmotherly mask she wore so well. "Go home, child," Clara said gently. "Forget what you saw. Violence is like a contagious disease. Don't let it infect you just because you saw someone else catch it." Maya hesitated, biting her lip. She turned her phone screen toward Clara. "I can't forget it, ma'am, and neither can the internet. I live-streamed it." Clara stared at the small screen. The video was already playing on a loop, a shaky, vertical recording of Clara redirecting Jax's force, sending him flying through the air. The view count was climbing so fast the numbers were blurring. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 views in less than 15 minutes. The comments were scrolling by in a frenzy of emojis and capitalized text. "Who is she? Grandma got hands. Fake. This has to be staged, and the technique is perfect. That's old-school judo." Clara felt a cold pit open in her stomach. This was her worst nightmare: exposure, recognition. The past she had run from was catching up to her at the speed of a fiber optic cable. "Take it down," Clara said, her voice sharp. "Child, you don't know what you've done. Take it down right now." Maya pulled the phone back, confused. "But you're a hero. Look at the comments. People are saying you move like a legend. One guy said you look like the Iron Rose from the old Chicago tapes." The name hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous. Clara gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning white. Before she could respond, the door to the main gym burst open, slamming against the wall. Jax stood there, leaning heavily on the doorframe, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes burning with a humiliated fury. He had recovered his breath, but his pride was dead, and in its place was a vindictive, petty cruelty. He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "You," he rasped, his voice raw. "Get your things, get out, you're fired. I want you off my property in 5 minutes, or I'm calling the police for assault." The students behind him looked horrified. "Sensei, you can't." One of them shouted, "She didn't do anything, you challenged her." Jax spun around, his eyes wild. "Silence! Anyone who defends her can leave with her. This is my academy. My name is on the door." Clara stepped out of the closet, her bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't look at Jax with anger. She looked at him with a profound, weary sadness. She walked past him, her head high, the very picture of dignity in the face of a child's tantrum. "You don't have to call the law, son," she said quietly. "I was leaving anyway. A place with no respect has no foundation. It'll crumble on its own soon enough." She stopped next to Maya and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Keep your guard up, baby girl. And take that video down. Some stories aren't meant for the world. Clara walked toward the exit, the glass doors sliding open to reveal the dark, rainy night. She stepped out into the cool air, leaving the toxicity of the gym behind, hoping that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As Clara waited at the bus stop down the street, clutching her coat tight against the wind, she didn't know that Maya hadn't taken the video down. In fact, the video had just been shared by a major martial arts news channel with the headline, "Unknown Janitor Humiliates Arrogant Black Belt." Across the city, in a high-rise penthouse office overlooking the skyline, a man in a tailored suit was scrolling through his tablet. He stopped at the video, hitting replay once, twice, 3 times. He zoomed in on Clara's face, then on the scar on her forearm. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "I found her," he said into the receiver. "The Iron Rose. She's in Sector 4. Send the retrieval team." It's time to collect on that 30-year-old debt. Back at the gym, the atmosphere had collapsed into chaos. Jax was in his office, pacing back and forth, trying to do damage control, but his phone was exploding with notifications. His social media, usually a shrine to his ego, was being flooded with mockery. He refreshed his feed and saw a new comment pinned to the top of the viral video. It was from an account verified as Grandmaster Ryu, a living legend in the martial arts world. The comment read, "The young man has no root. The woman is using the lost style of the Chicago underground. I haven't seen that movement since 1994. Find her. I want to meet the woman who humbled the prince." Jax threw his phone across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. He sank into his leather chair, hands gripping his hair. He wanted revenge. He wanted to destroy the old woman who had ruined his life in 2 minutes. But deep down, in a place he wouldn't admit to, he was terrified. Because he realized now that he hadn't been fighting a janitor. He had been fighting a ghost, and ghosts are very hard to kill. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle by the time Ma'am Clara reached the bus stop at the corner of 4th and Main. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the wet pavement, reflecting the turmoil inside her mind. She pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her throat, the damp cold seeping into her bones and making her arthritic knees ache with a dull, throbbing rhythm. It was a pain she usually welcomed as a reminder of her age, a sign that she was just a normal woman living a normal life. But tonight, the pain felt like a betrayal. Her body was stiffening up just when she needed it to be fluid. She checked her watch. The number 42 bus was 5 minutes late. Every minute she spent standing under the flickering yellow light felt like an hour. She kept her head down, watching the rainwater swirl into the storm drain, but her senses were hyper-alert. The hairs on the back of her neck were standing up, prickling with the same primitive warning system that had kept her alive in the underground circuits 3 decades ago. It was the feeling of being watched, the sensation of a predator's eyes fixing on a target. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the adrenaline from the gym was playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew better. The streets talk if you know how to listen, and right now, the streets were whispering her name. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, blindingly bright against the rain-slicked asphalt. Clara stepped forward, expecting the familiar rumble of the city bus, but instead, a sleek black sedan slowed to a crawl and pulled up to the curb. The engine purred with a quiet, expensive menace. The tinted windows were pitch black, offering no view of who was inside, but the car itself screamed authority and danger. It wasn't the kind of vehicle that stopped for grandmothers in cleaning uniforms at 10 at night in this part of town. Clara took a slow step back, her hand instinctively sliding into her pocket to grip the hard plastic handle of her heavy keychain. The passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Clara made in a year. He didn't look like Jax or the boys at the gym. He didn't have the flashy muscles or the arrogant swagger. He moved with the efficient, predatory grace of a wolf. He held a black umbrella, which he opened calmly, shielding himself from the rain as he walked toward her. "Ms. Washington," the man said. His voice was smooth, polite, and completely devoid of warmth. It wasn't a question. He knew exactly who she was. Clara didn't answer. She planted her feet, shifting her weight slightly to her back leg, settling into a subtle defensive stance that looked like nothing more than an old woman bracing herself against the wind. "My name is Vector," the man continued, stopping just outside striking distance. "Mr. Vance saw your performance tonight. He was quite impressed. It brought back a lot of memories for him. He would like to invite you for a conversation." The name Vance hit Clara like a bucket of ice water. Silas Vance, the man who ran the betting rings in the 90s, the man who had owned the contract of the fighter she had paralyzed. She hadn't heard that name in 20 years, and hearing it now on a rainy street corner confirmed her worst fears. The past hadn't just found her, it had come to collect. "I don't know any Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice raspy but steady. "And I'm not looking for conversation. I'm looking for the number 42 bus, so if you don't mind, step aside." Vector smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes. "We insist," he said softly. As he spoke, the rear doors of the sedan opened and two more men stepped out. They were bigger than Vector, thick-necked and grim, wearing long raincoats that barely concealed the bulk of their bodies. They spread out, flanking Clara, cutting off her escape routes. This wasn't a challenge like the one in the gym. There were no rules here, no mats, no students watching. This was an abduction. Clara felt a surge of fear, but she shoved it down into the furnace of her gut and burned it into fuel. She looked at the three men, calculating the odds. 3 against 1. 30 years ago, she would have finished this in 10 seconds. Tonight, with cold joints and a tired heart, it was going to be ugly. "I'm going to ask you one time," Clara said, her voice dropping an octave, taking on the tone of the Iron Rose. "Get back in your car and drive away." Vector sighed, closing his umbrella and handing it to one of the large men. "I was hoping you'd be difficult," he said. "The boss said to bring you in one piece, but he didn't say you couldn't be bruised." He nodded to the men. The one on the left moved first, reaching out to grab Clara's arm. It was a lazy grab, assuming she was just an old woman. That was his first and last mistake. Clara didn't pull away. She stepped into the grab, her left hand snake striking out to grip his wrist while her right elbow smashed upward into the soft underside of his chin. The impact made a wet, sickening sound, like a melon hitting pavement. The man's head snapped back, his teeth clacking together with bone-shattering force, and he crumbled to the wet sidewalk without a sound. The other two men froze for a split second, processing the violence. Clara didn't wait. She spun toward the second heavy, who was now fumbling inside his coat, likely for a weapon. She couldn't let him draw it. She kicked out low, aiming not for his legs but for the side of his knee joint. Her heavy work shoe connected with precise, devastating accuracy. There was a sharp pop, and the man howled, his leg buckling sideways at an unnatural angle. He went down to one knee, groaning in agony. Clara followed up with a palm strike to his ear, a percussive blow that ruptured his equilibrium and sent him sprawling into the gutter, retching. Vector was the only one left standing. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at his two fallen enforcers, then back at the 60-year-old woman breathing heavily in the rain. He took a step back, reaching behind his back. "You're making this worse for yourself," he hissed. Clara didn't waste breath on words. She knew she had about 10 seconds of energy left before her adrenaline crashed. She lunged forward. Vector was fast. He pulled a telescoping steel baton from his belt and swung it in a vicious arc aimed at her temple. Clara ducked, feeling the wind of the weapon whistle through the air above her head. Her knees screamed in protest at the sudden movement, a sharp bolt of pain shooting up her thigh, but she ignored it. She drove her shoulder into Vector's midsection, tackling him against the side of the black sedan. The metal of the car groaned under the impact. Vector gasped, the air leaving his lungs, but he managed to bring the baton down on Clara's shoulder. Pain exploded in her left arm, radiant and blinding. She gritted her teeth, suppressing a cry. She couldn't use her left arm now, it hung uselessly at her side. She had to end this. She used her body weight to pin him against the car, then drove her right fist into his solar plexus, followed immediately by a chop to the vagus nerve in his neck. Vector's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slid down the side of the car, unconscious before he hit the ground. Clara staggered back, gasping for air. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but she felt like she had run a marathon. Her left shoulder was throbbing with a fiery pulse, and her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked around. The street was empty. The rain was washing the blood into the gutter. She was alone with 3 unconscious men and a very expensive car. She knew she couldn't stay. The police would come, or worse, more of Vance's men. She looked down at Vector. His phone had fallen out of his pocket and landed screen up in a puddle. It was buzzing. The caller ID read the penthouse. Clara stared at it for a moment, then crushed the phone under the heel of her boot, shattering the screen and silencing the call. The rumble of a diesel engine signaled the arrival of the number 42 bus. It turned the corner, its headlights sweeping over the scene, the black car, the bodies on the ground, and the old woman standing amidst the carnage. Clara pulled her coat collar up to hide her face and stepped back into the shadows of the alleyway behind the bus stop. The bus slowed, the driver looking confused at the empty stop, then hissed its doors shut and continued on its way. Clara didn't get on. She couldn't go home. They knew who she was. They likely knew where she lived. If she went back to her small apartment, she would be leading the wolves right to her door. She thought of the picture of her daughter on her nightstand, the only family she had left. She couldn't risk them finding her. Clara turned and began to limp down the dark alleyway, moving away from the main road, away from her home, and away from the life she had built. Tears mixed with the rain on her face. She had spent 20 years scrubbing floors to be invisible, to be a nobody. But the iron rose had been dug up, and now she had to do the one thing she hated most in the world. She had to go back to the underground. There was only one person in the city who might be able to help her, a man she hadn't spoken to since the night she walked away. She didn't know if he was even still alive, or if he would shoot her on sight for leaving the way she did. But she had no choice. She walked for an hour, sticking to the shadows, until she reached the industrial district, a maze of abandoned warehouses and rusting factories. She stopped in front of a dilapidated brick building with a faded sign that read, "Franklin's Auto Repair." The windows were boarded up, but she could see a faint sliver of light coming from the basement level. She hesitated at the heavy steel door, her hand hovering over the rusted knocker. This was the point of no return. Once she knocked on this door, Ma'am Clara the janitor was officially dead. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer for forgiveness, and knocked 3 times, 2 fast, 1 slow. The code of the old guard. Silence stretched out for a long minute. Then the sound of heavy locks disengaging echoed from inside. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing a slice of a face, one suspicious eye staring out into the dark. "We're closed," a gravelly voice grumbled. Clara stepped into the sliver of light, pulling down her headwrap so her face was visible. "Hello, old friend," she said softly. "I need a place to bleed." The eye widened in recognition, and the door was thrown open. Standing there was a massive man with a gray beard and hands covered in engine grease. He looked at her, then at her injured shoulder, then out at the empty street. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask where she had been for 20 years. He simply stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. "Get in here, Rose," he grunted. "You look like hell." As the heavy steel door slammed shut and the locks clicked back into place, sealing out the rain and the city, Clara leaned against the wall and finally let herself slide down to the floor. She was safe for now, but as she looked at her trembling hands, she knew the truth. The fight in the gym hadn't been an accident. The fight at the bus stop hadn't been a coincidence. A war was coming, a war between the new world of viral fame and the old world of blood and honor. And whether she liked it or not, the Iron Rose was going to be the weapon that decided the winner. The interior of Franklin's auto repair smelled of grease, old rubber, and the lingering smoke of cheap cigars, a scent that hit Clara with the force of a physical memory. It was the smell of safety, the perfume of the underground sanctuary where fighters used to patch themselves up before the world became too polished and digital. Franklin led her down a narrow metal staircase into the basement, a space that was less of a workshop and more of a fortress. The walls were lined with racks of tools that looked more like surgical instruments, and in the center of the room sat a heavy oak table under a single, swinging bulb. Franklin didn't say a word as he pointed to a wooden chair. He walked over to a metal cabinet, retrieved a first aid kit that looked like it had seen a war zone, and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a dusty bottle. He slid one glass across the table to Clara and took a long, burning swallow from the other. Clara sat down, wincing as her shoulder throbbed in protest. She took the drink, her hand shaking slightly, and let the alcohol burn away the chill of the rain. "Let me see it," Franklin grumbled, pulling a stool closer. He gestured to her shoulder. Clara peeled back the layers of her coat and the damp t-shirt, revealing the skin that was already turning a deep, angry purple. The baton strike had done damage. The tissue was swollen, hot to the touch, and pulsing with a dull, rhythmic agony. Franklin hissed through his teeth, a sound of sympathetic pain. "You're lucky, Rose," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel in a mixer. "Another inch to the left and he would have shattered your collarbone. As it is, you've got a deep contusion and probably a hairline fracture. You won't be lifting that arm above your head for a week." He began to work, applying a cold, pungent salve that smelled of menthol and arnica, his large, grease-stained hands moving with surprising tenderness. Clara watched him, studying the gray in his beard and the lines etched into his face. They were both relics, survivors of a time when fighting was about honor, not hashtags. "I didn't want this, Frank," Clara whispered, the pain in her voice having nothing to do with her shoulder. "I just wanted to do my job. I just wanted to be invisible." Franklin paused, holding a bandage in mid-air. He looked up at her, his dark eyes sharp and unyielding. "Invisibility is a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe," he said sternly. "You think you can just bury the Iron Rose. You think you can walk away from who you are and expect the world to forget. Nature abhors a vacuum, Clara. When you left a hole in the city, and men like Silas Vance filled it with garbage." He finished wrapping her shoulder, pulling the bandage tight. "Vance owns everything now, the gyms, the tournaments, the police. He's turned the art into a circus, and he's been looking for the one thing he can't buy, a legend." Clara looked away, shame heating her face. "I had to leave," she said defensively. "After Marcus, I couldn't look at my hands without seeing blood." Franklin sighed, sitting back and wiping his hands on a rag. "I know, and we respected that, but you can't run from a debt this big. That video of you, it's not just viral, Clara, it's a declaration of war. You humiliated his golden boy. You showed the world that his elite training is nothing but flash and dance. You threatened his bottom line. Vance isn't sending men to beat you up because he's angry. He's sending them to break you publicly so he can restore his brand." Franklin reached into his pocket and pulled out a cracked tablet. He tapped the screen and slid it across the table. "Watch." Clara looked at the screen. It was a live stream from a press conference. Jax Sterling was sitting behind a microphone, looking bruised and battered, his arm in a sling. He didn't look humbled, he looked dangerous. He was spinning a narrative, his voice smooth and practiced. "The incident at the academy was a misunderstanding," Jax was saying to the cameras. "I allowed the woman to demonstrate a specific pressure point technique. It was a teaching moment. However, it seems she took advantage of my generosity to assault me. I am officially issuing a challenge. If this mystery woman is truly a warrior, let her step into the ring at the Outcome event this Saturday. Official rules. No cheap shots. Let's see if she can stand against a true champion when I'm actually fighting back." The reporters flashed their cameras, eating up the drama. Clara pushed the tablet away, disgusted. "He's a child," she muttered. "He's lying to save face." Franklin nodded. "Of course he is, but the world believes him, and Vance is banking on you running. If you run, they'll spin it that you're a coward, a criminal who assaulted a teacher and fled. They'll hunt you down, Clara, and they won't stop with you." Franklin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know you have a daughter, Clara, Vanessa. She works at the hospital downtown, right? 3 kids." Clara's heart stopped. She shot out of her chair, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. "How do you know that?" she demanded, her voice rising to a panic. "If you know, Vance knows." "Exactly," Franklin said, not moving. "Vance knows everything. If you disappear tonight, if you get on a bus to another city, do you think he'll just let it go? He'll go after Vanessa. He'll squeeze your family until you come out of hiding. You can't run, Rose. The only way to protect them is to end this. On your terms." Clara paced the small room, her mind racing. She felt trapped, cornered like a rat in a maze. She had spent 20 years protecting her family by staying away from them, and now her past was threatening to consume them anyway. She stopped in front of a shelf filled with old trophies and faded photographs. She saw a picture of herself from 1990, young, fierce, holding a championship belt. She looked at her reflection in the glass, an old woman in a cleaning uniform, tired, broken, and scared. "I can't fight him, Frank," she said, her voice trembling. "Look at me, I'm 60 years old. My knees are shot, my shoulder is messed up. I have wind for maybe 2 minutes of hard exertion. Jax is 28, he's in his prime. If I get in a cage with him for 3 rounds, he will kill me." Franklin stood up and walked over to a large, dust-covered trunk in the corner of the room. He dragged it into the light, the metal hinges screaming in protest. "You're right," Franklin said. "If you fight him his way, speed, power, endurance, you will lose. You will die, but you aren't going to fight him his way." He opened the trunk. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic, was a pair of old, worn leather gloves and a black silk robe embroidered with a single red rose. "You're going to fight him your way," Franklin said, picking up the gloves. "The old way, the way of the root and the willow." "He has youth, Clara, but he has no soul. He fights with anger, you fight with truth. You don't need 3 rounds, you need 1 mistake, and a boy like that, he's nothing but mistakes waiting to happen." He held the gloves out to her. "Vance wants a show, so give him one, accept the challenge. Demand it be televised. Make it so public that if he touches a hair on your daughter's head, the whole world will know. Hide in the light, Rose." Clara stared at the gloves. They looked small, battered, and insignificant. But as she reached out and touched the cool leather, she felt a spark ignite in her chest, a spark she thought had been extinguished in the rain 30 years ago. It wasn't rage, it wasn't pride, it was duty. She was the elder, she was the gatekeeper, and it was time to teach the children that some fires cannot be put out. She took the gloves from Franklin's hands. "If I do this," she said, her voice hardening into steel, "I do it my way. No referees stopping the fight early. No points. We go until one of us can't stand." Franklin grinned, a wide, toothy smile that transformed his face. "That's the iron rose I remember." He pulled a phone from his pocket. "I know a reporter, an honest one. We're going to record a response right now. We're going to control the narrative." Clara nodded and began to strip off the rest of her cleaning uniform. She wasn't a janitor tonight. She pulled on a spare, oversized hoodie Franklin handed her. It smelled of motor oil, but it felt like armor. She sat back down at the table, the pain in her shoulder now a focusing point, a reminder of the debt she owed to the man in the rain. Franklin set up the phone, propping it against a toolbox. "Ready?" he asked. Clara looked into the camera lens. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She stared straight into the digital eye, imagining Jax Sterling on the other side. "Record," she said. Franklin tapped the screen. "My name is Clara Washington," she began, her voice deep and resonant, filling the small basement. "For 20 years I have cleaned your floors, I have emptied your trash, I have been invisible to you, but tonight you saw me. Mr. Sterling says he wants a challenge. He says he wants to see if I can stand against a true champion." She leaned forward, the shadows playing across her face, highlighting the scars and the lines of age. "I am a mother. I am a grandmother. And I am the Iron Rose. I accept your challenge, boy, but know this. When you step into that ring with me, you are not stepping in with a cleaning lady. You are stepping in with history, and history is heavy." She signaled for Franklin to cut the feed. The room was silent again, but the energy had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, grim determination. "Send it," Clara said. Franklin hit send. Within seconds, the video was uploaded. Within minutes, it would be everywhere. The bell had been rung. There was no going back now. "You need rest," Franklin said, closing the trunk. "I have a cot in the back office. Sleep. Tomorrow, we start training. We have 3 days to get your body to remember what your mind never forgot." Clara stood up, her legs feeling heavy but steady. "Frank," she said, pausing at the door to the back room. "Thank you," Franklin grunted, turning back to his tools. "Don't thank me yet, Rose. The hardest part is coming. You woke up the dragon. Now you have to slay it." Clara lay down on the narrow cot, listening to the rain drumming against the pavement above. She closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. Instead, she visualized the fight. She visualized Jax's speed, his power, his arrogance. She played the scenario over and over in her mind, looking for the opening, looking for the weakness. She knew that on Saturday night, she wouldn't just be fighting for her life. She would be fighting for every invisible person who had ever been looked down upon, every elder who had been dismissed, every woman who had been told she was too old or too weak. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of oil and dust. The janitor was gone. The storm was coming. The sun rose over the city the next morning, but for Ma'am Clara, there was no light, only the harsh glare of a single bulb swinging in the damp basement of Franklin's auto repair. The air was cold, smelling of rust and wet concrete, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled atmosphere of the Sterling Elite Martial Arts Academy where Jax was preparing. The city was buzzing. Clara's video had done exactly what Franklin predicted. It had turned a local dispute into a national spectacle. The internet was divided into 2 camps, those who mocked the delusional grandmother and those who prayed for the arrogant prince to get knocked out. But down in the basement, there were no comments, no likes, and no distractions. There was only pain. Clara stood before a heavy canvas bag that Franklin had filled with sand and hung from a steel beam. Her hands were wrapped in old, fraying cloth tape that smelled of wintergreen. Every time she struck the bag, a jolt of electricity shot up her arm and exploded in her injured shoulder. She grunted, biting her lip until it tasted of copper, but she didn't stop. Franklin sat on a stool in the corner, watching her with the critical eye of a mechanic listening to a failing engine. He wasn't counting reps, he was watching her soul. Across town, in the gleaming, mirror-lined training hall of the Thunderbolt Gym, Jax Sterling was putting on a show. A camera crew from a major sports network was filming his workout. He was shirtless, his skin glistening with oil, wearing a high-tech altitude mask that made him look like a comic book villain. He was hitting focus mitts held by a young assistant who looked terrified. Jax's punches were fast, incredibly fast, creating a rhythmic, snapping sound that echoed for the cameras. He was moving like a dancer, spinning, feinting, and shouting with every strike. To the untrained eye, he looked invincible, a machine of pure speed and violence. But Franklin, watching a live stream of the workout on his cracked tablet back in the basement, shook his head slowly. "Look at him," Franklin growled, gesturing for Clara to stop. "He's fighting the air. He's fighting his own vanity. He's not planting his feet because he wants to look light. He thinks this is a gymnastics competition." Clara wiped the sweat from her eyes, her chest heaving. "He's fast, Frank," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Faster than I ever was." Franklin stood up and walked over to her. "Speed is just distance divided by time," he said, tapping her temple. "You don't need to be faster than him. You just need to be there before he arrives." The training over the next 48 hours was a study in contrasts. Jax spent his time in a hyperbaric chamber, drinking protein shakes that cost more than Clara's monthly rent, and getting deep tissue massages from a team of therapists. He was surrounded by yes men who told him he was a god, that the old woman was a joke, and that he would knock her out in the first 10 seconds. He believed them. He was feeding his ego, starving his fear, and growing more brittle by the hour. Clara, on the other hand, was stripping everything away. Franklin didn't have her run. Her knees couldn't take it. Instead, he had her stand in the horse stance for hours until her legs burned and shook violently, training her mind to endure agony without breaking. He filled a bucket with coarse rice and had her plunge her fingers into it, twisting and gripping until her skin was raw, strengthening the tendons in her hands so that when she grabbed Jax, he would feel like he was caught in a steel trap. She drank bitter herbal tea that tasted like dirt, slept on a hard cot, and spent hours in silence, visualizing the fight. She wasn't building muscle, she was hardening her spirit. She was becoming a rock that the wave would break against. By late Friday night, the eve of the fight, the atmosphere in the city was electric. The Battle of the Ages, as the networks were calling it, was set to take place in the old warehouse district in a venue known as the Foundry. It was neutral ground, away from the polished gyms and the corporate arenas. It was a place where the floor was concrete and the air was thick with history. Clara sat in the back of the repair shop, her hands soaking in a bowl of warm vinegar and salt to toughen the skin. Franklin walked in, holding a black garment bag. He looked serious, his usual grumpiness replaced by a solemn respect. "It's time," he said softly. He unzipped the bag and pulled out the robe, black silk, heavy and cool to the touch, with the red rose embroidered on the back. It was the same robe she had worn the night she walked away 30 years ago. Clara stood up, drying her hands. She touched the silk, and a tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "I don't know if I can do this, Frank," she whispered, the doubt finally cracking her voice. "I'm just a cleaning lady, I'm tired." Franklin placed his heavy hands on her shoulders. "You were never just a cleaning lady, Rose," he said firmly. "You were a queen in hiding, and tomorrow you take back your crown, not for you, for Vanessa, for the grandkids, for every person who's ever been told they don't matter." Saturday arrived with a gray, overcast sky that promised a storm. The Foundry was already packed by 7 in the evening. The crowd was a strange mix of wealthy elites in designer suits who had come to see a spectacle, and working-class people in work boots and denim who had come to see one of their own stand up to the system. The noise was deafening, a roar of anticipation that vibrated the corrugated metal roof. In the red corner, Jax Sterling was bouncing on his toes, wearing a gold-trimmed robe that shimmered under the spotlights. He looked magnificent, a golden statue of youth and power. He was shadowboxing, throwing rapid-fire combinations that drew cheers from his section of the crowd. He looked at the camera and winked, supremely confident. In the blue corner, there was no entourage, no music, no flashing lights, just a heavy steel door opening slowly. The crowd quieted down, a hush spreading from the back of the room to the front. Clara walked out. She wasn't wearing a flashy costume. She wore simple black trousers and a black tank top, her arms bare, revealing the long, jagged scar and the defined, corded muscles that belied her age. The black silk robe hung loosely from her shoulders, the red rose on her back seeming to glow under the harsh arena lights. She didn't bounce. She didn't look at the crowd. She walked with a slow, deliberate limp, her face a mask of absolute calm. Franklin walked a step behind her, carrying a bucket and a towel. As she climbed the steps to the ring, a raised platform surrounded by ropes, the silence held. It wasn't the silence of boredom, it was the silence of respect, mixed with a healthy dose of fear. She looked different than she had in the video. She looked dangerous. She stepped through the ropes and stood in her corner, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of canvas and fear. The referee, a nervous man in a striped shirt, called them to the center of the ring. Jax towered over Clara, standing 6'2" against her 5'7". He leaned down, his face inches from hers, chewing gum aggressively. "Last chance to walk away, Grandma," he whispered, loud enough for the ringside microphones to pick up. "I promise I'll make it quick. Don't make me break a hip." Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, clear, and terrifyingly empty. "You talk too much, child," she said softly. "The time for talking is done. Now we pray." Jax sneered and stepped back, raising his fists. The referee looked at both of them, raised his hand, and chopped it down. "Fight!" The bell rang. Jax exploded out of his corner like a sprinter. He wanted to end it immediately to prove his dominance with a highlight reel knockout. He threw a flying knee, a flashy, high-risk move intended to crush Clara's chest. The crowd gasped. It was fast, incredibly fast. But Clara didn't back up. She didn't flinch. She did something that defied all logic. She stepped forward. As Jax was airborne, committed to the strike, Clara took one small step to the left and dropped her weight, turning her shoulder into a battering ram. She met his momentum not with force but with structure. She caught his thigh on her shoulder and simply stood up. The physics were undeniable. Jax, suspended in the air with no leverage, bounced off her solid stance like a tennis ball hitting a brick wall. He spun in the air and landed hard on his side, skidding across the canvas. The crowd erupted. Jax scrambled to his feet instantly, his face bright red. He wasn't hurt, but he was embarrassed. He had tried to look cool and had ended up on the floor within 3 seconds. "Lucky," he screamed, abandoning his technique. That was luck. He charged again, this time throwing a barrage of punches, jabs, crosses, hooks, aiming for Clara's head. Clara moved. She didn't dance, she flowed. She kept her hands low, parrying his strikes with minimal movement, slapping his wrists away, ducking under his hooks by mere inches. To the audience, it looked like she was moving in slow motion while Jax was in fast forward, yet he couldn't touch her. She was a ghost in the machine. But Franklin, watching from the corner, saw the truth. Every time she slipped a punch, Clara winced. Every time she parried, her injured shoulder screamed. She was buying time, reading his pattern, waiting for the mistake. She knew she couldn't keep this up for 3 minutes. She was already tired. She needed him to get desperate. And Jax, predictable in his arrogance, was getting desperate. He couldn't hit her. The old woman was making him look like a novice. The crowd was starting to laugh. He heard a heckler yell, "She's schooling you, Prince." That snapped something in Jax's mind. He stopped throwing jabs. He pulled his arm back for a haymaker, a massive, telegraphed overhand right designed to take her head off. It was the punch of a bully, not a martial artist. It was powerful, yes, but it left his entire midsection exposed. Clara saw it coming a mile away. This was it, the moment. She stopped moving. She planted her feet in the center of the ring, rooting herself to the earth. As Jax's fist came hurtling toward her face, she didn't dodge. She raised her left arm, her injured arm, to block it. The impact was sickening. A crack echoed through the silent arena as Jax's forearm collided with Clara's already damaged bone. Clara cried out, a short, sharp sound of agony, her knees buckling slightly. The crowd screamed, thinking it was over, but Clara didn't fall. She used the block to trap his arm against her chest. She had him. She stepped in, invading his space, her face inches from his terrified eyes. She saw the realization dawn on him. He had thrown everything he had, and she was still standing. Lesson 1, Clara whispered through gritted teeth, the pain in her arm fueling her strike. Roots run deeper than ego. She drove her right fist, not into his face, but into the soft spot just below his ribs, the liver. It wasn't a fast punch, it was a heavy punch. It carried the weight of 30 years of scrubbing floors, 30 years of being ignored, 30 years of silence. It dug deep. Jax's eyes bulged. His mouth opened in a silent scream. His legs turned to jelly, and he crumpled. He didn't fall backward. He folded forward, dropping to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Clara stood over him, clutching her broken arm to her chest, breathing hard. The referee rushed in, waving his arms. It was over. But as the referee moved to raise Clara's hand, the lights in the arena suddenly cut out. Pitch blackness swallowed the ring. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Then, the giant screen above the ring flickered to life. It wasn't a replay of the fight. It was a live video feed. The image was grainy but clear enough. It showed a hospital waiting room. A camera panned over to a woman in a nurse's uniform sitting at a desk. It was Vanessa, Clara's daughter. A man's hand entered the frame, holding a phone with a timer counting down from 60 seconds. A distorted voice boomed over the arena speakers, chilling the blood of everyone present. Congratulations, Iron Rose. You won the game, but you forgot the rules. The debt is always collected. You have 1 minute to surrender yourself to the men at the north exit, or the hospital has an unfortunate accident. The lights slammed back on. Clara stood frozen in the center of the ring, her victory turning to ash in her mouth. She looked at the screen, then at the north exit, where 4 men in dark suits were waiting. The crowd was silent, terrified. Jax was still on the floor, retching, unaware of what was happening. Franklin jumped onto the apron, his face pale. "Clara, don't," he shouted. It's a trap, but Clara was already moving. She dropped her winning hand. She looked at the camera broadcasting to the world, tears streaming down her face. "Don't touch her," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I'm coming." She climbed through the ropes, ignoring the referee, ignoring the title, ignoring the cheers that had turned to gasps. She limped toward the north exit, toward the men, toward the darkness, surrendering her victory to save her child. The walk from the center of the ring to the north exit was the longest journey of Clara's life. It felt longer than the 30 years she had spent hiding, longer than the bus rides in the rain, longer even than the nights she spent mourning the brother she couldn't save. The cheers of the crowd had died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed down on the arena like a physical weight. Thousands of eyes watched her, confusion and horror written on faces that, just moments ago, had been twisted in bloodlust. They were witnessing something they didn't understand, a victory that looked like a funeral. Clara held her injured arm against her ribs, every step sending a fresh spike of nausea through her body. She didn't look back at Franklin, who was screaming at the security guards trying to restrain him. She didn't look back at Jax Sterling, who was still on his knees, staring at the canvas in a daze. She only looked at the 4 men in dark suits standing like sentinels by the exit door. They were faceless, emotionless, the grim reapers of a corporate underworld that didn't care about honor or heart. As she reached them, the lead man didn't say a word. He simply opened the heavy steel door, allowing the cold night air to rush in, and gestured for her to step into the darkness. Clara stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the light and the noise of the arena. She was instantly grabbed. Rough hands seized her good arm, while another set of hands patted her down with professional efficiency. They didn't care about her broken bone. They shoved her forward toward a waiting black van with tinted windows. The pain in her arm was blinding, a white-hot fire that threatened to make her pass out, but the image of her daughter Vanessa, smiling and unsuspecting at the hospital desk, kept her conscious. She was shoved into the back of the van, the metal floor cold against her knees. The doors were slammed, locking her in a box of darkness that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. As the engine roared to life and the vehicle lurched forward, Clara slumped against the wall, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed. She didn't pray for her own safety. She knew that ship had sailed. She prayed that the voice on the speaker had been telling the truth, that her surrender had bought her daughter's life. The drive was a blur of turns and stops. Clara had no idea where they were taking her, but she could feel the incline of the road changing, the smooth hum of the tires on the highway giving way to the stop-and-go rhythm of the city's center. After what felt like an eternity, the van slowed and descended. The pressure in her ears changed. They were going underground. The vehicle came to a halt and the doors were thrown open. Clara blinked in the harsh fluorescent light of a private parking garage. The concrete walls were clean, the floor painted a glossy gray. This wasn't a warehouse or a dungeon, this was the belly of high society. The men pulled her out, their grip firm but not overtly violent anymore. They led her to a private elevator, the kind with gold trim and a keycard slot. As the numbers above the door climbed higher, 20, 30, 40, Clara realized exactly where she was. She was in the spire of the Vance Tower, the tallest building in the city, looking down on the streets she used to clean. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a penthouse that looked more like a museum than a home. The floor was marble, the walls were glass, and the view of the rainy city was breathtaking. But Clara had no eyes for the view. Standing by the window, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid, was Silas Vance. He was older than she remembered, his hair now silver, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating like a shark that had learned to wear a suit. He turned slowly, sipping his drink, and smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Or should I say the Iron Rose, you put on quite a show tonight. My investors were very entertained. Although, I must admit, I lost a substantial amount of money on Mr. Sterling, but the spike in viewership, that was priceless." Clara stood in the center of the room, dripping wet from the rain and sweat, cradling her broken arm. She looked out of place among the Italian leather furniture and abstract art, a smudge of reality in a world of artificial perfection. "Where is she?" Clara rasped, her voice trembling with rage. "I did what you asked. I walked away. Call your dogs off the hospital." Vance chuckled softly, walking over to a large mahogany desk. He pressed a button on a remote, and a large screen on the wall flickered to life. It showed the same hospital waiting room, but this time the camera pulled back. The man holding the phone wasn't a hitman. He was a teenager in a hoodie, holding a phone up to a pre-recorded video loop on a tablet. Vanessa was there, working calmly, completely unaware that anyone was watching her. "The wonders of technology," Vance said, gesturing to the screen. "There was no bomb, Clara, there was no sniper, just a live feed I hacked into weeks ago and a voice modulator. Fear is a powerful tool. It makes people do irrational things like surrender a fight they had already won." The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. Her daughter was safe. She had always been safe. It was a trick, a cheap, dirty parlor trick. Clara felt a wave of relief so strong it almost buckled her knees, followed instantly by a tsunami of fury. "You liar," she hissed. "You sick, twisted man." Vance shrugged, unbothered. "I'm a businessman, Clara, and you are a loose end that I needed to tie up. You see, you disrupted the ecosystem. Jax Sterling was a product, a very expensive product. You broke him tonight, not just his ribs but his brand. You showed the world that he was counterfeit. That's bad for business." He sat down on the edge of his desk, looking at her with a mix of curiosity and contempt. "But nature abhors a vacuum. You broke my champion, so now you owe me a replacement. I don't want you to fight, Clara. You're too old. Your body is failing. I saw you flinch in the ring. But your mind, your technique, that is a resource I can mine." He picked up a folder from the desk and tossed it onto the marble floor at her feet. Inside that folder is a contract. It binds you to the Vance Corporation for the next 10 years as a head trainer. You will take the raw recruits I find, the angry, the desperate, the violent, and you will teach them the old way. You will teach them the root and the willow. You will turn them into weapons for my arena. He took a sip of his drink. "If you sign, your daughter keeps her job, you get a nice salary, and you fade back into obscurity. If you refuse, well, the hospital feed might be fake, but the men standing behind you are very real. And accidents happen in this city every day. A slip on a wet floor, a hit and run. It would be tragic." Clara stared at the folder. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the sound of rain lashing against the glass. She looked at Vance, this man who thought he could buy and sell human souls like stocks. He didn't understand. He thought the fight was about winning or losing. He thought it was about leverage. Didn't understand that the fight was about spirit. Clara slowly knelt down, her knees cracked. She reached out with her good hand and picked up the folder. Vance smiled, thinking he had won. "Smart choice," he murmured. "I knew you were reasonable." Clara stood up, holding the folder. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at Vance. "You think you know me," she said quietly. "You think because I cleaned floors, I learned to bow, but you forgot what I was cleaning up." She ripped the folder in half. The sound was sharp, tearing through the tension in the room. She dropped the pieces on the floor. "I cleaned up trash, and I'm looking at a pile of it right now." Vance's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of cruelty. "Disappointing," he said coldly. "Kill her, make it look like a robbery gone wrong, dump the body in the river." The men behind Clara moved. The sound of a safety clicking off a pistol echoed in the large room. Clara tensed, preparing for the end. She was injured, unarmed, and outnumbered. She couldn't fight her way out of this. She closed her eyes, making peace with her God, but the shot never came. Instead, a sudden deafening crash shattered the world. The glass wall behind Vance, the reinforced, storm-proof glass overlooking the city, exploded inward in a shower of glittering shards. A dark shape swung through the broken window on a cable, landing on the marble floor with a heavy thud. It was a man, dressed in black tactical gear, his face covered. Before Vance's men could react, the figure raised a device and fired. A flashbang grenade detonated in the center of the room. A blinding white light and a concussive boom disoriented everyone. Clara, instinctively covering her eyes and ears, felt the floor shake. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the sounds of chaos. Gunfire erupted, but it wasn't aimed at her. The men who had been guarding her were shouting, falling, their weapons clattering to the floor. The smoke from the grenade filled the room, acrid and thick. Clara coughed, crouching low, trying to find cover behind a sofa. A hand grabbed her good arm. She lashed out, ready to fight, but a voice cut through the smoke. "Easy, ma'am, we're getting you out of here." The smoke began to clear, drifting out of the broken window into the rainy night. Clara looked up at her rescuer. He pulled down his mask. It wasn't Franklin. It wasn't the police. It was one of the students from the academy, the quiet one who always stayed late to hit the bags. And behind him, stepping through the shattered window from the maintenance rig outside, were two more figures. One was Franklin, holding a heavy wrench, looking terrified but determined. And the other was Jax Sterling. Jax looked terrible. His face was swollen, he was holding his side where Clara had hit him, and he was soaking wet. But his eyes were clear. For the first time, the vanity was gone. He looked at Clara, then at Vance, who was cowering behind his desk, calling for security on a phone that wasn't working. Jax walked over to Vance, grabbed him by the collar of his expensive suit, and lifted him off the ground. "You told me the fight was honorable," Jax spat, his voice thick with emotion. "You told me it was about the sport. You didn't tell me you were threatening grandmothers and nurses." Vance struggled, his face purple. "You idiot." He screamed, "I made you, I own you, put me down or you'll never work in this town again." Jax looked at the old man, then threw him onto the couch. "I quit," Jax said. He turned to Clara. "The live stream didn't end, Clara. Maya kept filming. She filmed you surrendering, she filmed the men taking you. The whole city saw it. We tracked the van using the traffic cams. Franklin called me. I owed you a debt for the lesson you taught me." Franklin rushed over to Clara, checking her arm. "We have to go," he said urgently. "Security is coming up the stairs. The police are on their way, but Vance owns half the precinct. We need to get you to safety before the lawyers and the dirty cops show up." Clara looked at Jax, at the student, at Franklin. The invisible woman had an army. She looked at Vance, who was trembling with rage on his couch. "This isn't over," Vance screamed. "I will burn this city down to find you." Clara walked over to him. She didn't hit him. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice amplified by the silence of the room. "You can't burn the city. The city is made of iron, and we have been in the fire a lot longer than you." She turned to her rescuers. "Let's go." They moved quickly. The window washer's rig was waiting outside. It was a terrifying, swaying escape in the wind and rain, descending 40 stories down the side of the skyscraper while sirens wailed in the distance below. As they reached the ground and jumped into Franklin's battered truck, Clara looked back up at the broken window, a jagged scar on the face of the perfect tower. She was in pain, she was a fugitive, and she was tired. But as the truck sped away into the night, disappearing into the labyrinth of streets she knew so well, Clara Washington smiled. The janitor had taken out the trash. Franklin drove the battered pickup truck like a man possessed, weaving through the rain-slicked streets of the industrial district, putting as much concrete and distance as possible between them and the Vance Tower. In the passenger seat, Clara sat in silence, her adrenaline crashing hard, leaving her shivering and exhausted. Jax Sterling sat in the cramped back seat, his designer clothes ruined, his body bruised, looking out the window at the passing streetlights with the shell-shocked expression of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the span of 3 hours. The cabin was filled with the sound of the engine's roar and the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers, but nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. They were fugitives now, an old woman, a mechanic, and a fallen idol, running from a billionaire who owned the law, or so they thought. The silence was broken by the chirping of a phone. It wasn't Franklin's and it wasn't Clara's. It was Jax's phone, which had been buzzing incessantly in his pocket. He pulled it out, staring at the screen with wide eyes. "Turn on the radio," Jax whispered, his voice hoarse. Franklin glanced in the rearview mirror, confused, but reached out and twisted the dial. The static cleared, replaced by the urgent, breathless voice of a news anchor. "Breaking news tonight from downtown. Federal agents have surrounded the Vance Tower following a shocking live broadcast that appears to show business mogul Silas Vance ordering the execution of a kidnapped woman. The video, streamed by a drone owned by a local hobbyist, and corroborated by footage from inside the Sterling Academy, has gone viral globally in the last hour. The police commissioner has just issued a statement confirming that arrest warrants have been issued for Vance and several of his associates on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and racketeering. Franklin slammed on the brakes, pulling the truck to the side of the road under a highway overpass. The three of them stared at the radio as if it were a holy relic. The anchor continued. In a related story, hundreds of citizens have gathered outside the downtown hospital to form a human chain, protecting the building after threats were allegedly made against the family of the victim, now identified as Clara Washington, a former employee of the Vance Corporation. It seems the entire city has mobilized to protect the Iron Rose. Clara let out a sob, covering her mouth with her good hand. She hadn't been alone. She hadn't been invisible. Maya had been filming. The students had been watching. The drone Jax mentioned, the maintenance rig support, had been recording everything. The city hadn't just watched, it had stood up. They didn't go to a safe house. They went to the hospital. When they arrived, the scene was unlike anything Clara had ever witnessed. A crowd of hundreds stood in the rain, students from the gym, neighbors from her bus route, people she had nodded to in the grocery store for years. When they saw the battered truck pull up and Clara step out, a cheer went up that drowned out the thunder. It wasn't the bloodthirsty roar of the Fight Club, it was a wave of warmth and protection. The crowd parted, allowing her to walk through. Vanessa was waiting at the sliding glass doors, tears streaming down her face. Clara collapsed into her daughter's arms, the pain in her shoulder forgotten in the embrace of the only thing that truly mattered. "I knew you were tough, Mom," Vanessa whispered into her ear, squeezing her tight. "But I didn't know you were a superhero." The fall of Silas Vance was swift and brutal. Stripped of his public image and abandoned by his investors, his empire crumbled within days. The video of him ordering Clara's death was played on every news station from Tokyo to New York. He was arrested in his penthouse, dragged out in handcuffs past the very window Jax had shattered. The legal proceedings would take years, but his grip on the city's martial arts scene was broken forever. The contracts he held over fighters were nullified, the corrupt judges were exposed, and the fear he had used as currency evaporated like steam in the wind. 3 months later, the Sterling Elite Martial Arts Academy reopened its doors. But it was no longer elite, and the sign out front had changed. It now read simply, "The Roots Community Gym." The interior had changed too. The expensive mirrors were still there, but the atmosphere was different. There was no smell of fear, no ego, no bullying. On the main mat, a class was in session. Jax Sterling was teaching. He wasn't wearing his gold-trimmed robe. He was wearing a simple white gi, a white belt tied around his waist. He had insisted on starting over, stripping away the rank he hadn't earned through character. He was teaching a group of teenagers how to hold a stance, his voice patient, kind, and humble. "Power doesn't come from anger," Jax was saying, correcting a boy's posture gently. "Power comes from the ground. It comes from knowing who you are when nobody is watching." In the corner, sitting on a wooden bench with a clipboard, was Ma'am Clara. Her arm was out of the sling, though she still rubbed the shoulder absently when it rained. She wasn't cleaning. A professional service came in at night to do that now. She was the head instructor, the keeper of the key. She watched Jax teach, a small smile playing on her lips. He looked over at her, seeking approval. She nodded once, a subtle dip of her chin. It was enough. Jax beamed, a genuine smile that made him look younger and lighter than he ever had as the prince. Maya walked in, wearing her own gi, bowing as she entered the floor. She walked over to Clara and handed her a cup of peppermint tea. "Full house again, Sensei," Maya said, gesturing to the packed room. "We have a waiting list of 50 people." Clara took the tea, inhaling the steam. "Let them wait," she said softly. Good things take time. We aren't building fighters here, baby girl, we're building people, and you can't rush the roots. Later that evening, after the last student had bowed out and the lights were dimmed, Clara and Jax stood by the door locking up. The gym was quiet, peaceful. You know, Jax said, looking at the floor he used to disrespect. I never apologized for the footprint. Clara laughed, a rich, deep sound that filled the empty space. You apologized with your actions, son. That's the only language the floor understands. She opened the door, looking out at the city skyline where the Vance Tower stood dark and empty in the distance. Do you miss it? Jax asked suddenly. Being the Iron Rose, the fame, the cheers. Clara stepped out into the cool night air, buttoning her coat. She looked at her hands, hands that had fought, hands that had cleaned, hands that had healed. The rose is just the part of the plant you see for a few days, she said, turning to look at him. It's pretty, but it dies quickly. The iron is the roots. It's what holds you down when the storm comes. I don't miss the flower, Jax. I'm just happy to be back in the dirt. She patted his cheek, her hand warm and rough. Now go home, rest. Tomorrow we work on your left hook. You're still dropping your guard. Jax bowed deeply, lower than he had ever bowed to anyone. Good night, Sensei. As Clara walked to the bus stop, humming a gospel tune, she didn't feel invisible anymore. She walked with the slow, steady rhythm of a woman who owns the earth beneath her feet. She wasn't a legend, and she wasn't a janitor. She was Clara, and in a city of glass and noise, she was the hardest thing there was. She was the truth. And that is the story of how a simple act of disrespect toppled an empire and reminded a city that you should never judge a book by its cover or a fighter by her uniform. If you enjoyed this journey of justice, redemption, and the power of the underdog, please smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have many more stories of hidden heroes waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Until then, keep your roots deep and your guard up.